yet find that to date, the United States does not abide by the same philosophy. When our country taxes its successful workers at ridiculously high rates without reaping any benefits, it walks down a dangerous path of inefficiency. Consequently, my partner Jacob and I ask you to affirm with us that the United States federal government should substantially reform its revenue generation policies by repealing the estate tax. We ask you to judge this debate round through the criterion of efficient policy making. Efficient policy making. If we prove to you that repealing the estate tax would promote efficiency in our economy, we believe that we should win today's debate round. Let us now look to background so we can understand the status quo policy. Background point 1 is estate tax. Estate tax. It was defined by the IRS in March 2011 as, quote, a tax on your right to transfer property at your death, end quote. Now, background point 2 is the current rate of the estate tax. The current rate of the estate tax. According to Dr. Anthony Davies, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University, in December 2010, the estate tax rate was, quote, a 35% on estates over $5 million per individual or $10 million per couple, end quote. Now, our third and final background point is a tax hike. A tax hike. Because the Bush tax cuts will expire in 2013, the estate tax will simply resume its previous rate. From the same sources above, quote, in 2013, without legislative action, the estate tax increases even further to 55% on estates with over $1 million in assets, end quote. Because we believe that there is nothing to lose and much to be gained by ending this unnecessary tax, we present the following plan. Congress, the President, and the Internal Revenue Service will immediately repeal the federal estate tax. No funding will be necessary to complete this plan. Once again, we immediately repeal the federal estate tax. There are three main reasons, also known as justifications, for supporting and passing our plan. You can label justification 1 as increased revenue. Increased revenue. Subpoint under here is the harm, or the problem our plan will fix. Currently, the government loses potential revenue. The government loses potential revenue. The Institute for Research on the Economics of Taxation told us in 2006 that, quote, the estate tax reduces federal revenue because of the steps people take to avoid the tax and the damage the tax does to jobs and incomes. Its repeal should be made permanent, end quote. The second B under this justification is the solvency, which shows us how we solve for the harm. Repeal will increase revenue. Repeal will increase revenue. $23.5 billion worth. Stephen Enton writes in 2009 that, quote, ending the estate tax portion would appear to cost $19.2 billion, but total revenues would rise by $23.3 billion, end quote. Finally, justification 2 is the economy. The economy. Subpoint under here are the harms. There are two main harms regarding the economy in the status quo. And harm 1 is that businesses sell out early. Businesses sell out early. According to Harry Alford in 2006, quote, it is a deceptive rationale to represent that only 1% of Americans are affected by the estate tax. That is the percent of decedents whose estates will actually write a check each year to the IRS. But the polling company has found that twice as many family businesses sell out early rather than pay the tax. This often means a loss of jobs and a business in the community, end quote. The second harm is decreased savings and investment. Decreased savings and investment. Daniel Mitchell tells us in 2009 that, quote, the estate tax discourages economic growth by reducing saving and investment. The estate tax sends a perverse message to America's entrepreneurs, investors, small business owners, and farmers that if you squander as quickly as possible, the government will not tax you. But if you behave responsibly and invest in the nation's future, the government will grab a huge chunk of your money when you die. And this matters because capital formation is the key to growth. Higher living standards are possible only if people invest by setting aside some of today's income. But a punitive death tax has reduced America's stock of saving and investment by nearly $850 billion. It is also important to note that all the problems from the estate tax will accelerate within a year. The current estate tax rate is at 35% with a $5 million exemption rate. But as we saw in the third background point, in just over a year, the top rate will spike up to 55% over $1 million. If we do not repeal the estate tax now, families with only $1 million in assets will pay over half of their inheritance to the government after the death of a family member or business owner. Subpoint B under this justification is solvency. Solvency. We have dozens of experts or solvency advocates who agree that we must repeal the estate tax. These advocates include the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, 117 congressmen, and 20 senators. And a list of the congressmen and senators can be provided upon request. By repealing the estate tax, two significant benefits will occur. We see these in subpoint C, the advantages. You can label Advantage 1 as 1.5 million jobs. 1.5 million jobs. According to Douglas Holtz-Eakin and Cameron Smith in 2009, quote, eliminating the estate tax would create roughly 1.5 million additional small business jobs. Consider that 1.5 million jobs are nearly half of the total jobs that the Obama administration hopes to save or create under its recently announced budget plan. This study suggests that simply killing the estate tax could bring them nearly halfway to that goal, end quote. Advantage 2 is business growth. Business growth. Curtis Dubé writes in 2010 that, quote, benefits from a full repeal of the estate tax include increasing small business capital by more than $1.6 trillion, increasing the probability of hiring by 8.6%, increasing payrolls by 2.6%, and expanding investment by 3%, end quote. As Paul Ryan said, what is the estate tax? It's a double tax on death. Economists will tell you that it's not really a tax that soaks the rich, but it's a tax on capital that deprives business investment and therefore job creation. The estate tax hurts those who don't directly have to pay the tax because it annihilates saving and investments, deprives us of at least 1.5 million jobs. Our government is not currently leaving its citizens free to regulate their own pursuits of industry. Instead, the government is taking away what its citizens earn under the guise of helping the nation. In order to restore our national and personal economic efficiency, we vehemently urge you to repeal the estate tax. Thank you.
Hey there, Brenna, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
Great, thank you. First of all, can I see Audrey, please?
Sure.
All right, now let's just jump into some questions. Starting off, first of all, what's your first justification about the increase in revenue? Now, you read us a number here about how repeal would increase in revenue. Now, this is on net, correct?
It's on what?
On net, this is netting out the negative effects of revenue and positive effects. Okay, and the number is $23 billion, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so why would revenues increase when the government is taxed?
The revenues will increase because we'll be expanding investment, we'll be expanding businesses, which means that we actually end up getting more money from the income tax because people will be wealthier.
All right, so this has to do basically with economic growth, correct?
Yes.
Okay, let's move down. Let's talk about justification number 2, which is about the economy. Now, the first point you made here was that businesses sell off early. Now, this is basically saying a business has to liquidate in order to pay the tax. They have to sell off the business, correct?
They don't always sell it off, but they do something to make sure that they don't actually meet the estate tax requirements. And sometimes that includes selling it off entirely.
Okay, can you give me an example of what something else would be?
And something else would be just simply stop investing in their business, laying off workers, taking down some of the business, shrinking it.
And this is in order to pay the estate tax.
Yes.
Now, what's the specific number of businesses that have had to do this, say over the past 10 years?
I believe it's 6,000 a year. Over the past 10 years, it's been about 6,000 a year.
Okay, and what's the definition of, is this small businesses, or what's the definition here?
It's a small business. I don't know the exact IRS definition of a small business. I don't think that there actually is one, but essentially a small business would be one that's not a corporation, works on a smaller scale, and it's typically family.
Thank you. Now, would you agree with me that there's currently preferences for small businesses so that more of them are affected, correct?
By the estate tax?
Yes.
There are a couple, although I believe that they're phasing out, and they're not actually going to be in place in 2013.
Thank you. Now, let's talk a little bit more about your advantage. Now, advantage number 1, you talked about job creation. Now, you read a study here by Holtz-Eakin and Smith, correct? Can you tell me a little bit about the methodology of this study?
The methodology of the study was what they looked at how many jobs the estate taxes actually cost us over the past few decades, and then they calculated how much we'd be able to increase job creation if we were to repeal it.
All right, now this study, is this looking at both the positive and the negative effects and then comparing them, or is this just looking at the positive effects?
It's looking at everything.
Okay, now let's move down to just a couple more general questions. Now, you claim to increase investment, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now within that, would you agree with me that in order for businesses to want to invest, there needs to be demand for their products and services?
Yes.
Okay, so the only way that investment creates growth is if there's also accompanying demand.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, if people invest, that's going to create growth right away, and typically they'll invest more if there is actually demand.
Okay, can you give me an example of a business or an individual who has invested when there wasn't demand for what they were selling?
Well, it's not just small businesses. There's investment. There's going to be investment that's not just actually small businesses investing in their businesses. It's talking about in the private sector and in the public sector as well.
Okay, and when you, all right, well, thank you. Looks like we're out of time. Here's yours.
You guys keep the track.